Jai Hind, everybody. Jai Hind, Chaulia sir. As we speak today at this point of time, a lot of things are happening at the geopolitical stage in the world and more focused in the West Asia. While Israel has just managed to go through the missile attacks by Iran in large numbers, and there are reported casualties as well as some infrastructure damage also, and it is probably now preparing for its response. But the fact is that there are a lot of turmoil which is undertaking at the international stage, where India is also going to get affected. And at this point of time, the subject today, which will be deliberated, is as to how India is going to navigate its strategic partnership and alliances in the backdrop of things which are happening on the world stage, whether in context with Russia, Ukraine, West Asia, USA, China, China's otherwise activities, and things like that. We could not have been more fortunate to get a speaker of Professor Sreeram Chauria's caliber, who is going to speak to us today. And I would like him to get introduced, though he doesn't need any introduction really speaking, by Dr. Monojit Das, before we request him to take the stage. Over to Dr. Monojit.
Thank you. Well, this is an honor for me to introduce Dr. Chaulia sir, but it becomes more challenging, as I mentioned already, a speaker who is renowned, but still, let me introduce. So Dr. Sreeram Chaulia sir is a social scientist and an opinion maker on international issues. He holds a doctorate, PhD, and a Master of Arts in Political Science from Maxwell School of Citizenships and Public Affairs, and the Master of Science degree in History of International Relations from London School of Economics and Political Science. Professor Chaulia teaches courses related to the subjects and has over 1,000 publications in these domains. His writings have appeared in journals across globe. Professor Chaulia sir has authored numerous books with leading publishing houses like Murray Books, Taylor Francis, Bloomsbury. His book, The Crunch Time and Narendra Modi's National Security Crisis, was published in 2022 by Rupa. His latest book, Friends, India's Closest Strategic Partners, has just been published by Rupa this year. Professor Chaulia sir writes column on international issues in Indian newspapers, Dainik Jagran, Hindi, and Hindustan Times, English. His op-eds and columns have been appeared in leading newspapers and magazines, including the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, Japan Times, South China Morning Post, and others. Professor Chaulia sir hosts the weekly Indian Diplomacy TV show on India's national broadcaster DD India. He is a regular commentator on international current issues on Sansad TV, DD News, and Republic TV in India, with over 700 television appearances to date. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Das. Thank you so much. Jai Hind and Namaste to all our friends at CENJOWS, distinguished officers from the armed forces and also the members of the strategic community. It's a real honor to be hosted by CENJOWS, which has got such a great reputation for high quality knowledge, deliberation, and analysis of military defense and strategic issues. Thank you so much for hosting me today. So I just wanted to kickstart by reflecting on the title of the talk, and especially the phrase global power transition. As you know, we are at the end of the post-Cold War era, and there is no longer a post-Cold War era or consensus or order. But what is to come in the subsequent to the post-Cold War era, and how do we define and even what do we call this new era, is up in the air, and it needs to be determined by world historical forces. So this transition from one era to another also involves transition of power from one or more major players to one or more new players. So historically, the power transition, if you look at the theory, it goes back to at least 60-70 years. And the rough idea was that, there are existing hegemonic powers, and then new great powers that arise that challenge the existing hegemonic powers, and as a result of which there is likely to be war, and as a result of which there is likely to be a lot of chaos, disruption, violence, instability, conflict, and at the end of which a new order with some equilibrium and some degree of relative peace will be established. That's the whole idea of the power transition theory. So global power transition, my first contention is that we are in an era where transition is happening. In India, we are often used to saying that we want a change from unipolar or bipolar order to a multipolar world order, and that is one way of looking at the power transition. The Organsky and these people who actually came up with the power transition theory in the 1950s and 60s were only talking about the contention between the number one and the number two powers in the world, and everybody else had to line up. But we are talking about a world potentially with four, five, six, or even seven major power centers, or seven great powers, or six or seven great powers. At least that is our aspiration. So it's in that context that strategic partnerships come in and have a different meaning in this era of power transition compared to an earlier era, the so-called post-Cold War era, or the unipolar era when United States was the predominant and unrivaled and unchallenged great power from 1991 onwards for at least the next 20-25 years or so. So this the meaning of strategic partnerships or alliances and all these things, which are essentially cooperative mechanisms and coordination mechanisms between like-minded countries, these change in eras depending on whether you are in a stable era or in an unstable one, or between two eras, which I think is the current state of being in the world, at least for the foreseeable future, maybe a decade or two before we can settle down and say that a new era has begun with a different power configuration. So, how are strategic partnerships different from earlier eras and to this era of power transition? This is an important point. My new book, which is just out, Friends, India's Closest Strategic Partners, talks about the Indian model of doing strategic partnerships in the context of this power transition, in the context of this what we call reconfiguration of the world order. You can see on the screen the cover of the new book is just out and should be available. It is already on Amazon and will be available in stores and stalls shortly. What I'm arguing here is that the way we do strategic partnerships itself has evolved over time. We began doing our early strategic partnership in the late 1990s. And that was a time when even the US and even China, all the big powers started entering into strategic partnerships, because in the post-Cold War period, if you can extract benefits from whichever side, you should have mutually beneficial relations with all those countries, irrespective of hard divisions. The idea was that in the bipolar period, the Cold War period, the two camps and one would not work with the other. But once that dissolved, all kinds of countries came up with the idea of strategic partnerships. So strategic partnership is not an Indian invention. It was being done by many countries and continues to be done. As of my research shows for this book, as of 2024, we have about 35, 36 or so strategic partnerships, majority of which are with bilateral, as in with other countries, but some of which are with groups, like with the European Union. We have a officially declared strategic partnership with the entire EU, which, as you know, has 27 member countries. But generally speaking, the crux of the strategic partnerships are bilaterals with other countries that are most significant for a country to enter into. So once we started, if you see the evolution of our strategic partnerships, we did it in the post-Cold War era. We did them in the unipolar era, and now I'm arguing we are in a different era. So the meaning and the intent and the direction of the strategic partnerships has evolved over time for us and also for other players. So in the book, actually, I compare the American model of doing strategic partnerships. It's different from their alliance system. You know, they have formal allies, right? You all know this. US has a lot of treaty allies with whom they have mutual defense treaties to come to each other's support in the event of being attacked. But they also do strategic partnerships with countries that are unwilling to become allies. India, of course, we know very well, we have a comprehensive global strategic partnership with the US. But the US has similar strategic partnerships with many countries, especially with the focus on the Indo Pacific region, for example, with Indonesia, with Vietnam, and so many others. So, apart from their core alliance system, they have now branched off into strategic partnerships. And the appendix of my book actually shows the list of all the strategic partnerships of the US, of China, and of India, chronologically, country by country and region by region. So the what I tried to do in the book is to show that the way India approaches strategic partnerships depends first of all on its own standing in the current in the extent global configuration of power, meaning that in the 1990s and 2000s we were considered what was called a group of middle powers. This was the term that most frequently used for India in those days. So, as a middle power, we had a certain philosophy and an approach towards these strategic partnerships. We wanted market access. We wanted to do more trade and investment with many countries. So that was one of the factors propelling the strategic partnerships in those days. And what is interesting is that we even signed. Uh, some of you who have not studied this might find it shocking or surprising from the current lens. But we even signed a so-called strategic partnership with the People's Republic of China in 2005. So now arguably it is our number one adversary. So on paper, that strategic partnership has not been scrapped or just been nullified officially, but in all practical purposes it no longer makes any sense to us, right? But in 2005, those were the early days when we had the RIC and the BRICS and all those things. These were considered to be middle power coalitions and strategic partnership with China at the time was still not considered a great power. It was rapidly accumulating economic and military muscle, but 2005, by no yardstick was it considered a great power at the time. It was still what we call the unipolar period. So we entered into all kinds of strategic partnerships, and we have approximately 35 or 36 of them today. You can see them in the appendix of my book. The most recent one, I think earlier this year, was Greece, and with Poland. So there are a few new countries which have become strategic partners. But the question is, are all these equally important to us? Not then and not now. Even in the unipolar period, they were not. And today they have a different meaning and intent, as I will explain. So once this power transition starts, approximately since the global financial crisis and the slowdown in the Western economies, 2008, 2009 onwards, and I would say definitely in the last 10 years, once China is catching up with the United States in a lot of indicators, especially economic, and even overtaking the US by some yardsticks, that's when you start seeing more and more consensus in the scholarly community and the strategic elites that China has become a great power, and you cannot deny that. In terms of the economic might, in terms of their fastest growing military modernization, and also in terms of the political influence through aid and loans and other forms of power projection in almost every continent of the world. In some places, overtaking the United States or even displacing the United States, like in Africa. So when this transition happens, how do you? What does this do to strategic partnerships? This is an important point I want you all to think about. when we signed up these partnerships, we wanted a multipolar world order. Even now, we want a multipolar world order, right? But the big difference is that there is a sharper strategic intent and content to these strategic partnerships today in this transition period than in the earlier eras. What do I mean by sharper? Let me explain to you. Initially, if you see the bilateral strategic partnerships we used to sign, let's say from the year 2000 until the year 2015 or so, yeah, after the turn of the millennium, most of these strategic partnerships did not have a counterbalancing component vis-a-vis China. And I've found some very surprising things in hindsight now, where we were actually talking about, for example, with Australia, even with Japan, a lot of these countries we signed strategic partnerships fairly early, even with the US, but then they were not aimed or intended to form some kind of a coalition to counterbalance China. Not before, at least not before 2013, 2014 or so. You see the joint declarations and statements at the time, the agreements, there was much more focus on countering terrorism, on countering jihadist extremism, on fundamentalism, on Pakistan sponsored extremism, those sort of things, you know. Not and at the time, the so-called global war on terror, the US was also involved in these things. Even the United States itself was not clear about competing or back Chinese influence worldwide in those days. So they were doing these strategic partnerships with what I would call second order strategic intent, not first order strategic intent. It was not the tussle for supremacy in the world that was driving the strategic partnership between two big powers. But now, as we are entering this fluid era, this transitory world order, which we expect to become a genuinely multipolar world order in the next 15, 20 years, you can see that both for India and for many other countries, strategic partnership has a different meaning. It is actually not simply to get economic benefits, or not simply to build connectivity and those sort of things. It's also with a clear, sharper edge to enter into closer military coordination, but with the purpose of thwarting or deterring a main adversary. And now that we are much clearer that we have one main adversary, increasingly, and this main adversary does not want a power transition to happen in Asia. So a lot of my book actually, so I have 7 countries, one chapter each for 7 of our closest strategic partners, as per my estimation. And in each of these cases, I'm showing how these partnerships, these strategic partnerships, help India to counterbalance China primarily. There are many other things we do with these strategic partners. There is still, free trade agreements and a lot of, bilateral investment flows. Our Make in India, all these things are dependent on, investment from these countries, technology transfer from a lot of these strategic partners. But the most important or interesting change compared to 10, 15, 20 years ago, when we used to sign these strategic partnerships, today, the upgraded versions of these strategic partnerships, we in our diplomatic lingo, initially it starts off as strategic, then we add comprehensive strategic, then we say, in the case of US, we say now comprehensive global strategic partnership. Likewise with Russia, it started as strategic, now we have called it special and privileged strategic partnership, and so on and so forth. So what has happened is that we have not only added a prefix to the strategic partnerships, but we have also tried to leverage them for our geopolitical and strategic objectives, which is to ensure our rise as an equal of China and the United States, which is to enable our rise as a leading power in the world, which will be also a great power in due time. So one of the points I'm making is that India is no longer a middle power. India is actually a rising power, which is an intermediate category between middle and great powers. India is not yet a great power, but it's on its way to being one, or is a would-be great power. So, how would a would-be great power, or a country that has all the attributes and the potential to become a great power, how does it handle strategic partnerships? It's a very delicate question, and I've tried to answer this in the book. Uh, we are, of course, quite wary of the term alliance, and we have not entered into alliances. But I've also juggled with that question in the book as to, are strategic partnerships enough or sufficient to take us through to our goal of becoming a leading power? Or will we at some point have to compromise the so called autonomy that comes in strategic partnerships in order to gain more security through a tighter alliance like relationship, particularly with the US, but also with uh, like minded Asian countries or Indo Pacific countries like Australia and Japan? Um, and France. Then you have a set of countries that are not directly related to counterbalancing China, but which are also our close strategic partners, Israel and the Emirates, UAE, the United Arab Emirates. I was looking at the list of strategic partnerships that some of our think tanks had compiled, like IDSA, for example. They did a study in 2011, I think, or 2010, 2011. And I looked up what they, in those days, they didn't have Australia in the list of our top partners. They did not have Israel. They did not have UAE. So in the Modi era, these three have really come to the fore. And so also the composition of who are our core strategic partners, our most important strategic partners, evolves and it varies over time. Um, Apparently, MEA, Ministry of External Affairs of India, made a list in 2006. There's a very interesting report about it. In 2006, they made a list of countries that are most valued for us, as or most consequential or important for us. There was no Australia, there was no Israel, and there was no UAE. But today, if you look at the depth of the economic, the military, and the geopolitical coordination we are doing with these three countries, they cannot be denied their spots as within the top 10 of strategic partners for us. So some of these older part, like Russia, of course, is an old strategic partner. It remains one. Um, France has also risen much higher than it used to be in the past, especially, as you know, because of the defense cooperation and the very deep geopolitical cooperation we are doing with them in the Indian Ocean, in the IOR, and the broader Indo-Pacific. So, what my point is that, as a country evolves or moves this way or that way, uh, on the up or down in terms of the global power configuration, it reconfigures who are its best friends or its closest friends, and it also imagines or reworks its old pre-existing friendships, and tries to reshape them with a new intent and a new direction. So, in other words, strategic partnerships are not set in stone, like they're not forever. We know very well from the example I just gave you that the so-called strategic partnership we signed with China during the Manmohan Singh period in 2005 makes absolutely zero sense to us today. There cannot be a partnership with a country that is trying to stymie India's rise and to block our path to great power status. So the important point I'm making in this book is that for India especially, strategic partnerships are essential stepping stones for our rise to great power status or leading power status. Without these, we cannot accomplish this goal, the centenary goal of a Viksit Bharat or a developed country and a leading power. Uh, Both the economic side and the geopolitical side, we cannot achieve our 2047 goals without these friends, without these strategic partners. And in a way, it's important and necessary to come back to these bilaterals, which I have done in this book, because of late it has become fashionable to look at, okay, we did a G20 summit, and we are voice of the global south, all those broader multilateral groupings where India is positioning itself as a leader. So sometimes people, even the discourse tends to be that we have already become world leaders because we are leading G20 or because leading the global south. 120 countries participate in our summits. So I'm not denying the importance of those and the soft power and other benefits that we get from those things. What I'm saying is that there is a tendency to think that the multilateralism is the pathway to great power status, or that multilateralism is necessary or the most important approach to great power status, because that is the how a relatively weaker country can gather 20 people or 100 people or 120 people around the table and assert itself, even though it does not have the economic or the military might of great powers. And in fact, the middle powers, if you see the characterization of middle powers, they multilateralism is supposed to be one of the most favored attributes or characteristics or foreign policy inclinations of middle powers. So of course, India will do that, and India continues to do multilateralism, and we are very good at it. We often take pride in the fact that we can be a bridge between East and West, North and South, and all those things. But here in the book, I'm talking about bringing the bilaterals back in and making sure that we are focused on the big bilaterals that we have, the most consequential bilaterals, the ones, like I said, which enable our rise in a very concrete way. I mean, if you look at the Emirates, for example, the UAE, it's extraordinary. The growth in the relationship, just the scale of the economic partnership, and also there's a military element to it because of the naval presence of the UAE along the Red Sea, and basically the western end of the Indian Ocean, northwestern end of the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea. So there is a lot that we are doing with the UAE that not only keeps Pakistan under check, but also has broader repercussions for China's role in the Middle East or West Asia. And as you know, before these horrible wars began last year in the region, we had very, very ambitious plans to expand our influence through connectivity projects such as the I2, U2, and the IMEC, all the way up to Europe via a lot of these friendly Persian Gulf countries, with the UAE, the Emirates being the number one or the most important strategic partner. So, and Prime Minister Modi realized this, and he invested in some of these newer relationships. So these are very fascinating to study, and I invite you to read the book. I have a whole chapter on India UAE and how it went from even hostility 20, 25 years back to being the closest, so close that Prime Minister Modi calls President and the ruler of Abu Dhabi, Mohammed bin Zayed, my brother. There's nobody else on the world on the world stage that Prime Minister Modi calls my brother, and there is a reason behind it, because we are getting so much from them, and they also get so much from us. That's the other point I've made in the book. Each of our strategic partners not only gives us, meaning not only gives us a lift to go up the power configuration, but we also give them a lot. So these are obviously reciprocal and much more win-win than what the Chinese call their strategic partnerships. You see, China has like almost 100 countries with whom they have signed strategic partnerships, and their strategic partnerships are different. They are to an extent they are to erode the US influence and to counterbalance the US, but more it is for economic and commercial gain and to extract natural resources from these countries. And there are some countries they call strategic partners whom they are actually exploiting and pushing deeper into the debt trap. But on paper, they are all signed up. They have signed up official strategic partnership agreement with China. So anyway, what I'm trying to say in this book is that the older ones need some nurturing or tinkering or reshaping. The most obvious is Russia. Russia, of course, is very much our strategic partner. I have a full chapter on it, and nobody can deny its value to us. But given this changing world order, and given the kind of sharp economic decline of Russia, where today it's just about a $2 trillion economy, and given sanctions, given the technological challenges that it faces, we are diversifying away from Russia, and it's shown in the data. and also in our diversification strategies becoming broader and broader. And in a way, France has come in such a big way, as a trusted strategic partner, that France is taking a lot of the pie that the Russians historically used to have. For example, in fighter aircraft, just to give one example. Um, so what I'm trying to say is that some strategic partnerships, like the older ones, they need to be reordered and restructured as per the needs of the contemporary times. And because of the Russian closeness to China, there are question marks about how viable this strategic partnership will be for counterbalancing China. um, Implicitly, Russia has always helped us to counterbalance China. Many in the West do not understand this. But how much longer can this continue? How much longer can Russia sustain itself? As interestingly, the rankings done in the earlier eras by IDSA and a few other think tanks, Russia used to be considered our number one strategic partner in terms of overall benefit and value that we get from them. I do not think it is a number one strategic partner today. So uh, it's there in the top 7. So what I'm trying to say, it's always fluid and it changes as per the evolving equations and the conflicts. Now, Dr. Manojit Das was talking about the wars that are going on. These, of course, are reflections of the power transition. If you take a big picture view, like a theoretical view or a generalized view, rather than going into the nitty gritty of what's happening in Lebanon or what's happening in the Palestinian territories, uh, rather, or what's happening in Donetsk or Luhansk. I mean, that's one way of looking at these. There are a lot of people who specialize in these individual countries and regions, and they go very deep into them. But if you take a drawback and look at the not the individual trees but the forest as a whole, and you see so many fires in so many parts of the world that are smoldering, then you're saying, okay, the era of relative stability when interstate war had been declining and had been coming down, that era may be over. The so-called long peace, they used to call the post-Cold War period the long peace. Under US liberal international order, uh, some rules will be maintained, and there will be no major power conflict, and we are going to all live happily. I mean, I'm trying to summarize it in a very simple way, but that was the idea of the long peace. But the long peace is not holding now. So a very, very moot question, and I'll leave it to all of you to think about, and I'll be happy to discuss with you. Can, if the era of long peace is over, if the post-Cold War era is over, if the unipolar era is over, and there's now more intense struggle and confrontation and conflict and violence in this power transition, current power transition, what is the utility of strategic partnerships, and how will we able to maintain these strategic partnerships going forward? It's We're juggling a lot of balls. Those 7 countries you see on the cover of my book, the maps of the 7 countries in circles, many of them don't see eye to eye with each other, especially Russia and the other Quad member countries. Um, and we are now seeing more and more, as a result of these wars, also a deeper polarization in the world between different camps. So the idea of strategic partnership was that, multi-alignment, right? We work with everybody. We don't confine ourselves to only one side. We are equally close to many players, as Prime Minister Modi himself has said. Now, can we sustain this thing? And as the contradictions deeper, can we sustain this multi-alignment, or will we actually be compelled in 5 or 10 years from now, let's say, to actually discard or to even give up some of these strategic partnerships like we have done with China? There is no longer any so-called strategic partnership with China. That is done and dusted. Likewise, maybe some other older partnerships may not survive the test of time. And we should be totally, my view, rational and not emotional about these things. When it comes to long term interests, which also have to adjust to the shifting geopolitical winds, we will need to be very cold and calculated on these matters. And that is how, for example, these 3 countries, Australia, Israel, and UAE, have become our top strategic partners in the last 10 years or so. They were not so before that. There was very less happening in terms of bilateral coordination at economic, military, and in geopolitical terms with these countries. So um, let me stop there and simply say that this is a very challenging period. How we manage these friendships, what we do with these friends, is going to ultimately determine our rise as a leading power in the world. Of course, diplomacy is not everything. We know that we need to grow economically at 7 to 8% consistently for next 15, 20 years at least. We know that we need to build up our military muscle. We have to spend more on defense. All those things, I'm not even going there because those are, I assume that everybody accepts that those are the means by which a rising power can become a great power. But apart from those, apart from economic growth and military modernization, there is a third element, which is this diplomacy to manage friendships and manage our friends and to extract the most from our friends and to use the friends as stepping stones for us to become a leading power or a great power. So much as usually the commentary about how India will become a superpower or great power, most of them say we have to have high economic growth and we have to build military, right? But the third thing is equally important. That is the focus of my book, which is the diplomacy and the need to keep on oiling old strategic partnerships, reinventing old strategic partnerships, and also acquiring and building new strategic partnerships as per the shifting configurations and the permutations and the equations between different competing sides in this highly divided world. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chaulia. We shall just take a few questions if there are some. Initially, I shall request all those people who have joined us on WebEx, in case you have any questions, please raise your hand. We shall come back to you or put your questions in the chat box. Okay, Priyanka, go ahead.
Thank you, sir, for that wonderful session. I am research assistant at CENJOWS. So my question is, I work on South Korea. So I wanted to ask you a question that South Korea has characterized itself long as a middle path. There has been also existent potential between the two countries through their respective policies, like as we saw New Southern policy during the Moon Jae-in administration, and also India potentially converting this whole scenario of look east to act east, and also including South Korea along with Southeast Asian countries. So in that context, my question is why South Korea cannot be considered as a potential enabler of India's prospect of becoming a greater power? Thank you.
Yeah, great question, Priyanka. Thank you. The Europeans also, they saw my book and the book cover, and the Germans were saying, why not Germany? Why only France? The British were saying, what about the UK? We are doing a lot of things together with the UK, and why isn't the UK, why aren't you giving it our country the equal status as France? In the case of Asia, Japan is our number one strategic partner. So as far as South Korea goes, we just don't have the same level of depth as we have with Japan. In terms of the economic relationship, for example, I quote Dr. Jaishankar, our external affairs minister, in the book. He talks about 4 revolutions in India, economic transformation, and Japan has a hand in every one of those 4 revolutions. South Korea has come up lately. I know it's become a major defense supplier also, and our K9, the Vajra tanks, and all those things we are acquiring with South Korean support. So South Korea has become more valuable for us, and we do have a strategic partnership, but it's not at the same level as that of Japan. And secondly, South Korea, my view is that it does more a kind of like bandwagoning or hedging towards China. It's not very clear about and also depending on the administrations in South Korea. Sometimes you have the so-called conservative administration, like the current administration, which tends to be more tightly in the US camp and more willing to counterbalance China and to push back China through military means especially, and also to diversify economic relations and to reduce dependence on China. But other times when the so-called liberals come in, because of the North Korea question and other reasons, they tend to be softer towards China. So Japan, on the other hand, consistently, so even though both South Korea and Japan are US allies, there is a difference, and I show this in chapter 1 of the book on Japan, how India and Japan are what I call quasi friends, meaning because India is a strategic partner of the US and because Japan is a treaty ally of the US, we are linked by the US at one level. And South Korea has not been willing to go that far with counterbalancing China the way Japan is. For Japan, they have territorial dispute, they have existential threat. They believe that China is trying to arm twist them and to change the status quo in the waters around the Japanese islands. And the Taiwan question, as many Japanese famously say, is also a Japan question. For South Korea, it's less so. So I would simply say that we get a lot of value from South Korea. South Korea is important, but I would not rate it as one of our top 7 partners.
Okay, anyone else from the WebEx participants? So there are no questions because you made it so clear and comprehensible. But actually, it was a very, very new and nuanced subject. We have been looking at strategic partnership basically as something much higher, of much concern. But you looking at all these strategic partnerships which India has signed, including the defunct one in practical terms with China. So that is a very, very interesting take, sir. And we are really grateful that despite poor health, you took time to speak to us. We have already relayed the entire session live to our viewers and hope that more and more people will see that. And this will be continue to be played up. So thank you very much, sir, and we look forward to more and more cooperation between OP Jindal and Center for Joint Warfare Studies, which you are well aware that we are the only tri-services think tank under the Chief of Defence Staff and Ministry of Defence. So I have known you with since a long time, but this is time that one has got so much time to spend together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you all, Jai Hind.